Hi friends, welcome to the Wild Side. I'm Steve Hall. Driving out on country roads and especially along city streets, we've seen a surge in outdoor activity. But while staying home is a dream come true for some, others are finding new ways to entertain and explore. And it seems a perfect time to discover what really belongs here and what needs to go.
So here we have a good example of two bird-sown invasive species. This is Chinese privet, Ligustrum sinensis, and then also the winter creeper, the vine that's growing up the tree here.
An outside invader can weaken even the strongest. It's why Margie Hunter stands as a vigilant guard over the native vegetation at her home in Nashville. She's an author and a dedicated member of the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council.
I have a real interest in it. I've studied native plants and understand about some of the ecosystems and so forth in which native plants occur, and I knew that invasive species were a problem.
An ongoing problem given the wind and wildlife that carry seeds to unwelcome destinations, as well as people who unknowingly plant invasive species and then discover how quickly they spread.
And part of that is because our plants here don't understand how those plants work. So the competition level is unequal. Our plants don't know how to effectively compete against it because they haven't evolved together. Their pests and diseases are back where they evolved, and they're not here. So they don't have things like that natural phenomenon to keep them in check. And maybe climate conditions are maybe more favorable here as well, so they don't have climate checks on them. And that allows them then, if they have certain other characteristics, to become invasive.
It's the sort of thing homeowners inquire about. And Margie was already the author of Gardening with the Native Plants of Tennessee, The Spirit of Place. So under the direction of council members and with funding through the Tennessee Department of Agriculture's Division of Forestry, she penned an educational primer.
So we wanted to put together a very easy way for them to go through the steps necessary to bring these things under control and get them out of their yard if they wanted to. The important thing is to identify the plant first. What plant are you looking at? Make sure you're actually got an invasive species, that you haven't confused it with a similar looking native species. So identification is the important first step.
Margie's actions agree with her words as she herself uses information from the primer to gain control over her own garden.
There are two plants that I struggle with quite a bit. One is bird-sown seedlings of the winter creeper, which is Euonymus hederaceus. So here's a bird-sown seedling right here, and it's coming up in the middle of another invasive species, which is the creeping monkey grass, Liriope spicata. And one of the reasons it's so bad is that its flowers will wind up producing fruits that the birds will eat and spread as well. So, but it also creeps vegetatively, and so it's just spreading all through the garden, and it's a real problem to try to eradicate. One of the banes of my existence, for sure.
Among the most prolific but detrimental non-native plants you might find in your yard are Chinese privet, winter creeper, tree of heaven, and English ivy. Margie calls kudzu the poster child for invasive species, and it grows so rapidly, sheep are often called upon to keep it under control. And then there's the Bradford pear.
In many instances, though, some of these plants were plants that were ornamental originally, like Bradford pear. You know, it was an ornamental, people bought it, put it in their yard. They thought it was sterile, but then come to find out, no, it does outcross with common pear. And then as they began to tinker with it and came up with other cultivars, there was enough genetic distinction between those cultivars that they could cross. And so then fruit was produced, it was no longer sterile, and thus we have the invasion of Bradford pear that we have today, all along interstates and roadways.
I will pledge my heart to the love we share through the good and the bad times too.
May 27th, 1995, Steve and I were married under this tree. We didn't know then what we know now, that Bradford pears are an invasive species, and as you might imagine, this tree is quite sentimental to us. In fact, every year when it blooms, I tell him that we can stay married another year.
That tree is everywhere. It has escaped. The horse left the barn a long time ago on that plant. So your one tree is not going to make one whit of difference, honestly. I wouldn't worry about it. Don't add any more.
But sentimentality does not get to trump the honeysuckle. Margie says it's an invasive plant, as bad for the birds as it is for the landscape.
It would be best to get rid of it, even though it has a nice fragrance, perhaps that we associate with our childhoods. It's also the same plant that you would go and you would pick the flower and you'd pinch off the base and pull out the stamen, and it would pull that little bit of nectar that you'd put on your tongue. So same plant there as well. That has a very strong association for me in my childhood. But I've learned to understand the dark side of bush honeysuckle and try to keep that uppermost in my mind, as opposed to the more romantic visions that we have of the fragrance and that little drop of nectar.
The dark side of invasive plants is progressive. So the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council publishes a list of each species in the state.
That list is divided into two categories. The established threats, those that have been around and creating problems for some time, and emerging threats, those that are beginning to show up. And so our list was formulated based on plants that can invade intact ecological systems. Things like our state natural areas or our state parks or state forests. Wilderness areas. Even today, there are some species that are beginning to show up, that emerging list that we're looking at. So things like Mahonia is one, Nandina, heavenly bamboo, is one that's showing up in the wild. Burning bush, Euonymus elatus, is showing up in the wild as well.
Although only a small percentage of non-native plants are considered invasive, researchers believe the speed at which they often spread can still cause a significant disruption in the environment.
Our native plants and our fauna have developed together, evolved together, and so they depend on each other, both for support and sustenance in the case of the wildlife with the plants, and then pollination and distribution services in terms of what the wildlife do for the plants. And so you disrupt those associations by introducing these non-native species that can then take over an area, and the whole system can begin to kind of fall apart.
It's easy to assume if you're buying plants in Tennessee that they're native, but that's not necessarily the situation. Margie says knowing your plants and what will work well in your yard is important for any consumer.
Sometimes you can get a false sense about a plant and not realize how it ties into the greater whole, and whether it's good or whether it's not very good. And so a little education, learning more about these things can be very helpful. So people that are home and working in their gardens right now, look for some of those the plants that you might want to get rid of. Make sure you've identified them correctly. On our website, you can look up any of these plants, and we'll have a full description of the plant, pictures of the plant, life history of the plant, where it came from, how it is being invasive and affecting the natural areas here, and then control methods. So all of that is on our website.
If you can catch an invasive species in your yard while it's still young, Margie says it will be easier. But vigilance is important. Even she must still stand guard.
Any kind of damage you can do in terms of getting rid of the foliage and so forth will knock it back, set it back, and begin to slowly but surely deplete the roots. So just go for it as best as you can.
In Nashville, I'm Annette Knoll Hall on the Wild Side.
The Tennessee Invasive Plant Council recommends you choose native plants for your property whenever possible, although they do say that most non-native plants have become naturalized and are no longer problematic. You can find more information at our website, wildsidetv.com.
Tennessee's Wild Side, broadcast for nearly 2 decades, was originally created through a vision of the Jackson Foundation. The foundation remains a supportive partner in the mission to educate viewers about wildlife, natural resources, and opportunities for outdoor adventure. Wildside is produced by Rockwater TV with support from Tennessee State Parks, where you can discover our state's diverse heritage through spectacular landscapes, family-friendly recreation, and affordable lodging. Tennessee State Parks, fun and adventure naturally. And with support from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, promoting wise uses of Tennessee's agricultural and forest resources to develop economic opportunities and to ensure safe and dependable food, fuel, and fiber for all citizens.